세계 최초의 그의 명상은 지금부터 시작하겠습니다. 존경하는 동포 여러분, 안녕하십니까? 오늘 사회를 맡은 김재기입니다. 인사드립니다. 먼저 바쁘신 중에도 오늘 부두의 통일 명강사 선발대에 참석하신 여러분들께 진심으로 감사드립니다. 귀한 시간을 내주신 만큼 오늘 강연회가 원만하게 진행될 수 있도록 적극적인 협조를 부탁드립니다. 먼저 국민 의례가 있겠습니다. 모두 일어나셔서 전면에 국기를 향해 주시기 바랍니다. 국기에 대하여 경례!
정의로운 대한민국의 무궁한 영광을 위하여 충성을 다할 것을 굳게 다짐합니다.
애국가 개창이 있습니다. 반주에 맞춰서 1절을 부르시겠습니다. 오 캐나다 제창이 있겠습니다. 이어서 순국 서절 및 호국 영령에 대한 묵념이 있겠습니다. 묵념. 이번에는 토론토 협의회 최진학 회장님 인사 말씀 있겠습니다.
안녕하십니까. 경동회장 최진학입니다. 반갑습니다. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending tonight's event and grateful welcome to our special guest. Special thanks to Consul General Kang Jung-si for your support. I will try today's event for the very first time hold the legendary lecture. In addition, our guest speaker, Professor Martin from Brock University, is an expert in Canada who knows very well about North Korea. He will give a lecture on the topic of the prospect of peaceful unification of South and North Korea from Canadian point of view. 다시 한번 행사에 참석해 주신 여러분께 감사를 드립니다. 오늘 행사는 토론토 총영사관의 협찬을 받아서 진행하게 되었습니다. 강정식 총영사님 감사합니다. 이번 부르의 명강연은 타이틀도 재미있게 세계 최초로 이루어지는 행사입니다. 이 행사를 위해서 특별한 손님을 모셨습니다. 바로 폴록대학의 버튼 교수이십니다. 교수님은 캐나다에서 북한을 잘 알고 계시는 유명하신 전문가이십니다. 오늘 말씀하실 주제는 캐네디언이 바라보는 한국의 평화통일에 대한 전망입니다. 그리고 2부에는 부르의 통일 명강사 선발대회를 갖습니다. 내년이면 분단 70년입니다. 일제 36년의 2배에 해당되는 기간입니다. 이제 통일이 될 때도 되었습니다. 저는 중요하게 생각하는 것이 준비를 더 잘해야 된다고 생각합니다. 그래서 저희 민주평통은 평화통일 공감대 확산에 초점을 두고 지금까지 활동을 해왔습니다. 그래서 쉽고 재미있고 가깝게 다가가려고 노력을 했습니다. 그 일환으로 오늘 바로 이러한 행사를 갖게 됐습니다. 여러분들 끝나는 시간까지 저희들하고 함께 해주시고 격려해 주신다면 저희들에게 큰 힘이 될 것 같습니다. 감사합니다.
이어서 강정식 총영사님의 인사 말씀 듣겠습니다. 박수로 환영해 주시기 바랍니다.
안녕하십니까. 오늘 민주평통 토론토 협의회 주관 통일 강연회 및 교회인 통일명강사 선발대회 행사 개최를 진심으로 축하드립니다. 아울러 이번 행사 개최를 위해 애쓰신 최진학 회장님을 비롯한 평통위원님들께 깊이 감사드립니다. 그리고 이번 통일명강사 선발대회 참가자 여러분께도 감사를 드립니다. 민주평통 토론토 협의회는 그간 동포사회와 주류사회를 대상으로 통일의 당위성과 통일로 가는 길에 대한 공감대 형성을 위해 앞으로 노력해왔습니다. 오늘 행사도 이러한 평통의 노력에 큰 도움이 되리라고 믿습니다. 특히 오늘 특별 강연을 하시는 찰스 버튼 박사님 발표에 많은 기대가 됩니다. 이번 강연을 통해서 남북 통일에 대한 캐나다인들의 시각을 잘 파악할 수 있는 계기가 되었으면 합니다. Hi, Dr. Charles Burton. I would like to thank you for being with us today and sharing your thought and perspectives on the national unification of Korea. I believe we will benefit a lot from your in-depth academic research on this important topic, as well as your rich diplomatic experiences in China. We look forward to your presentation. 통일전망과 관련해서 내년이면 한반도 분단 70주년이 됩니다. 그러나 여전히 북한은 핵무기 개발을 계속하고 있고 반인륜적인 인권 유린으로 여전히 국제사회의 강력한 비난이 대상이 되고 있습니다. 최근 유엔 총회에서 채택된 대북 인권 결의안에 대하여 북한은 핵무기 억지력 강화를 포함한 모든 대응을 취하겠다고 우리를 위협하고 있습니다. 이러한 북한의 시대착오적인 반인륜적인 행태에 대해 이제 세계 어느 나라도 지지하는 나라가 없습니다. 여러분, 통일은 반드시 올 것입니다. 그 통일은 반드시 자유민주주의와 시장경제를 기반으로 둔 통일이 될 것입니다. 통일은 북한 정권 하에서 신음하는 우리 북한 동포의 생존권과 기본권, 인권 보장을 위해서도, 그리고 한민족의 자존과 번영을 위해서도, 그리고 우리나라의 장래를 위해서도, 세계 평화와 번영을 위해서도 꼭 필요한 것입니다. 통일에 대한 당위성에 대해 모두 공감하면서도 때때로 그 방법론에 대해 있어서 심각한 이견이 있어 왔습니다. 그러나 방법론에 대한 논의가 국민 분열이나 정부사의 분열을 이야기함으로써 통일 자체에 대해서 목표를 달성하는 데 장애가 되는 그런 룰을 범해서는 안 될 것입니다. 또한 남북관계를 논함에 있어서 북한 동포를 위한 일과 북한 정권에 도움이 되는 일을 혼돈해서도 안 될 것입니다. 결국 한반도 평화 통일은 굳건한 국가 안보를 바탕으로서만 가능한 일이기 때문입니다. 아무쪼록 오늘 행사가 우리 모두가 평화 통일에 대한 의지를 가지고 통일로 가는 길에 대한 상호 이해를 높이는 유익한 계기가 되기를 빌면서 다시 한번 오늘 행사 개최를 위해 쓰신 모든 분께 감사를 드립니다. 감사합니다.
감사합니다. 이번에는 캐네디언이 바라본 한반도 평화 통일 전망이라는 그 통일 강연을 할 텐데요. 강사 소개는 우리 청소년 분과위원장 박준석 의원께서 해주시겠습니다. 박준석 의원.
네, 안녕하십니까. 박준석 의원입니다. 전 오늘 그 강의를 해주실 찰스 워튼 교수님에 대해서 소개를 해드리고 싶습니다. 지금 찰스 워튼 교수님은 브락 대학교에서 1989년도부터 정치학과 교수로 근무 중입니다. 그리고 1991년부터 중국 베이징에 있는 캐나다 대사관에서 외교관으로 1991년부터 93년까지 또 그리고 1998년부터 2000년도까지 활동을 한 바입니다. 버튼 교수님은 영국의 케임브리지 대학과 샹하이의 후단 대학을 다니시고 1987년도에 토론토 대학에서 박사학위를 받으셨습니다. 그리고 교수 활동을 시작하기 전에 버튼 교수님은 캐나다 국방부에서도 일을 한 바입니다. 버튼 교수님이 캐나다에서 최고의 중국과 북한에 관한 외교 정책의 전문가로 인정을 받고 계시며 캐나다 정부에서 중국 북한 컨설턴트로도 활동을 하고 계십니다.
Mr. Park. Great honor for me to be speaking in the presence of the Consul General of the Republic of Korea here in Toronto, Mr. Kang, and with President Choi and the senior officials of the National Unification Advisory Council Toronto chapter, and so many leaders and members of the Korean community of Toronto here tonight. As Mr. Park said, I have lived 3 years in Shanghai and subsequently have spent quite a lot of years in the People's Republic of China, working for the Government of Canada in various capacities. And I think that many of you might think that the political and economic system in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is something that only happened in North Korea after the defeat of the Japanese in World War II. But when I lived in China, it was a system with a Stalinist, Marxist-Leninist, one-party system, personality cult on the leader. Like in the classroom, we had the portrait of Chairman Mao and the pictures of Chairman Mao and his writings all over the campus. How's that? And we had to study the works of the leader every Friday afternoon. And the newspapers talked mostly about the activities of the leader. And the government was strongly anti-foreign, anti-US, anti-Japanese. The military and security agencies in China were very strong in those days. And there was no freedom of association, freedom of religion, many political prisoners, economic system that left many people cold and hungry. And China had successfully exploded a nuclear device a few years before I got there. So it was a closed society based on an ideology with a cult of personality and very little freedom for the people. And so I would say that, you know, due to the common Stalinist political and economic institutions, the China that I knew in the 70s is very much similar in a lot of ways, not exactly the same as North Korea today. But I think what gives hope to Koreans and to the world is that that system in China changed, and today it isn't a Stalinist society based on the cult of the leader Chairman Mao, and there is much more information and freedom and prosperity in that country. And so one hopes that perhaps, you know, the system in North Korea will also change. Nothing lasts forever, and that there are better days ahead for the Koreans who are living in the DPRK regime. In terms of the Canadian perspective on unification, from 1949 to 2001, Canada only recognized one government on the Korean Peninsula as legitimate. So we established diplomatic relations with the Republic of Korea in 1949. And then in 2001, Canada additionally established diplomatic relations with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And so prior to 2001, we only recognized one regime on the peninsula as a legitimate political regime. And after 2001, we recognized two regimes on the Korea Peninsula. And extending the diplomatic recognition to the DPRK was something that was very much opposed within our Ministry of Foreign Affairs at that time. I know this because it was exactly then that I was on my second posting as a diplomat in China, and I was working in the political section of the Canadian Embassy at that time. And in those years, it was the Canadian Embassy in Beijing that was responsible for Canada's connection with the DPRK authorities. So we met the North Koreans in Beijing. And I was the guy who had the file to look after our relations with North Korea. And in those years, in the late 1990s, beginning of the 2000s, as a diplomat, I was very concerned about humanitarian conditions in the DPRK. China was forcibly repatriating North Korean migrants to China back to North Korea. And we had information that some of those people that were repatriated, particularly North Koreans with military backgrounds and certain Workers' Party backgrounds, were subject to execution on return to the DPRK from China. Of course, most people were sent to the re-education camps, but some were executed. And I felt that it was important for Canada to press China to allow the UN High Commissioner for Refugees access to Yanbian and other Chinese areas bordering North Korea to assess whether the North Koreans who were in China were eligible for convention refugee status and therefore protection from being repatriated to the North. Thank you very much. And I should tell you that I supported Canada moving to establish diplomatic relations with the DPRK in 2001. And Mr. Lloyd Axworthy was our foreign minister at the time, and he had been influenced by his former Sunday school teacher, Lois Wilson, who was a senator. Senator Wilson established the Canada-DPR Korea Association about the same time. And so, even though most of the Canadian government foreign ministry opposed change to our relations with Korea, that we only recognized the ROK and did not acknowledge the legitimacy of the DPRK, Mr. Axworthy pressed for recognition, and I was the person who was pushing for this out of the embassy in Beijing. And at this time, I felt that it was important for Canada to identify and engage potential agents of positive political change in the DPRK regime. I felt that we could, try and assist progressive elements within that regime. This, needless to say, failed. But at the time, China had just signed the United Nations International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And when a nation signs a UN treaty, the suggestion is that that nation agrees with the principles articulated in the treaty and will change its laws and practices to come into compliance with that treaty. And this treaty, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, calls for freedom of association, freedom of the press, an independent judicial process, due process of law, free and fair elections for government officials, and so on and so on. And so at this time I felt that there was a trend in the world towards moving towards democracy. The Soviet Union had collapsed only a few years before, and I thought that if Canada might be able to play a positive role in bringing about a positive transition in North Korea, which would then eventually lead to reunification. And this was also the period of the ROK's Sunshine Policy, so we had some favorable response from some elements within the ROK, although the United States of America opposed very strongly Canada's recognition of the North Korean regime at that time. So, with a view to moving to negotiations between Canada and the DPRK for establishment of diplomatic relations, I was instructed to do my best to start to engage the North Korean ambassador in Beijing and his staff. And that ambassador and his staff mostly spoke Chinese very well, having been educated in China. And so I would frequently visit the North Korean embassy, and even got to the stage where the embassy of the Republic of Korea got in touch with the Canadian embassy in Beijing to inquire why a senior Canadian diplomat, was spending so much time at the North Korean embassy. Apparently, the Republic of China diplomats watch the door of the North Korean embassy to see who goes in and who goes out, and I was going in and out quite a lot. They just wanted an explanation. I didn't have much success. My conversation with the ambassador of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea seemed to stop mostly in agreeing that when it was winter in Ottawa, it was also winter in Pyongyang. When it was summer in Ottawa, it was also summer in Pyongyang. And we both agreed that springtime is a beautiful time of year with many flowers, both in Ottawa and in Pyongyang. That was about it. I also attended many interesting North Korean events, such as Kim Il-sung's birthday. And so I was invited to celebrate Kim Il-sung's birthday, although Kim Il-sung had died some years before. So there's not a lot of diplomatic precedent for celebrating the birthday of someone who is already deceased. And I wasn't sure, on behalf of Canada, how to represent my country at the late president's birthday party. Should I be wearing a brightly colored tie because we were happy about him having a birthday? Or should I be wearing a darker suit because, of course, Mr. Kim had died? I went into the embassy. There was an enormous white cake with red icing with the age that Kim Il-sung would have been if he was still alive on it. And most of the other guests seemed to be military people from Eastern European embassies. I asked my counterparts what this event was about, and they urged me to try the excellent North Korean wine. And the excellent North Korean wine was very good. Then, after we had celebrated the birthday, they started to usher us into another room to view a film. My Swedish counterpart, Lars Frieden, who is now the Swedish ambassador in Beijing, urged me to leave in a hurry. The reason I connected with the Swedes is that Canadian interests in North Korea and Pyongyang are represented by the Swedish embassy. But I said I wanted to see the movie. The movie lasted 3.5 hours. It consisted of Kim Jong-il visiting North Korean factories and farms on inspection tours. And I was quite shocked, actually, by the movie, because one could see from the movie the devastation in the North Korean countryside. The factories were in very shabby condition with primitive kind of equipment. And Mr. Kim was the only fat person there, smoking very long American cigarettes, and the workers were quite short and also very thin with hollow cheeks. It affected me deeply to see this movie. And also the idea that I remember from when I was a student, when we were taught Chairman Mao has penetrating insight into everything. So there was no area that in the 3.5 hours that Kim Jong-il was not able to give instruction. He was able to tell chicken farmers how to get more eggs from their chickens. He was able to tell lathe factories how to increase their productivity, etc., etc. But what struck me was that if these images that the North Korean embassy was showing to the diplomatic community was intended to give us a good impression of North Korea, then the situation there must be very grave, because what was it that they were not showing us of North Korea? So my thinking on North Korea started to become a bit distressed. Subsequently, we did establish the embassy, and officials from the North Korean Foreign Ministry came to Ottawa from New York, and they wanted to buy an embassy property to establish a permanent presence in Ottawa. But this was not reciprocal, and the Canadian Foreign Ministry refused to meet with them while they were in Ottawa and would not agree to the North Koreans establishing an embassy building in our capital. And I was told that for one reason we were concerned that they would use the diplomatic bag for drug smuggling and counterfeit currency business, because these North Korean embassies abroad have to provide revenue for the regime. And we didn't want to open up in Pyongyang. Mr. Axworthy had retired in 2000, and the interest in our intensifying our engagement with North Korea ended with Mr. Axworthy leaving the Foreign Service. I'd also left, although my leaving was not a big deal. So, where does this leave Canada's foreign policy toward the political future of the Korean Peninsula? Essentially, our attitude towards North Korea is that we feel that the North Koreans should accept the obligations of peaceful and responsible behavior that are incumbent upon it as a member of the United Nations. North Korea has signed and ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. A few years ago, I remember the UN, in observing that their reporting on their fulfillment of this agreement was inadequate, sent a very strongly worded letter to the North Korean regime telling them to please get into compliance. That was about it. So North Korea is not behaving in a way which we regard as acceptable in terms of international behavior. We know that different factors there. And we also are concerned about the fundamental rights and freedoms of citizens of North Korea. And we would like them to denuclearize, abandon the nuclear program, and so on. So, you know, our policy towards North Korea is not one of engagement, because the North Koreans, of course, are not amenable to this kind of stance. In 2010, the Government of Canada further tightened its relations with North Korea with the controlled engagement policy. And right now, the government only allows bilateral contact with the government of North Korea to discuss regional security concerns, to discuss human rights and humanitarian situation in North Korea, to discuss inter-Korean relations and consular issues. Occasionally, we have a Canadian who gets into trouble in North Korea. But all government-to-government cooperation and communication on topics not among those four I just listed are not permitted for Canadian government officials. So our engagement with North Korea has failed, and we have essentially no relations with that regime of any meaningful nature. We still have the Swedes representing our interests there, and we engage them at their mission in New York, the United Nations. But in terms of the overall question of reunification of the Koreas, the Canadian government overall foreign policy has three aspects. There are three things that Canada sees as critical in our relations with foreign countries, including North and South Korea. And the first one is promotion of prosperity. We want to engage in trade and investment, and happily we recently have achieved a free trade agreement with the Republic of Korea. Protection of security. We want a stable world that allows us to engage in our trade unfettered by terrorism and military threat. And thirdly, quite important, and an aspect of Canadian foreign policy that is different from many other countries, is the third pillar of our foreign policy doctrine is to uphold Canadian values in our dealings with foreign states. This policy was enunciated by the Liberal government in 1995 in a policy statement entitled Canada and the World, but it's still the policy that the Conservative government of Stephen Harper implements in foreign relations. Three pillars: prosperity, security, Canadian values. Well, as you know, our relations with the Republic of Korea are terrific. We have agreement on issues of trade, human rights, nuclear non-proliferation, disarmament, reform of the UN Security Council. We work together productively in G20, APEC, World Trade Organization, OECD. We have similar views on most multilateral and global issues. And so Canada is a very close friend of the Republic of Korea, and we value the relationship with the Republic of Korea very much. And of course, the Korean-Canadian community is a very important part of our Canada. And Canada has an official position of firmly supporting South Korea's continuing efforts to improve relations with North Korea and to lessen tensions on the Korean Peninsula. But I would like to suggest that, to me, the most important factor in the unification question is the stance of China. China is North Korea's only friend, I think, maybe Cuba. But it's not a country that has a lot of allies or states that are prepared to deal with that regime. China is pretty much it. And I have, in recent years, been invited to participate in Chinese internal discussions on the Korea question in institutes that usually have the name Strategic Studies in them, which are controlled by the Chinese Ministry of State Security. And it's the Chinese Ministry of State Security, not the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that the Chinese Politburo has assigned to oversee China's relationship with DPRK. You know, we have concerns about the Chinese complicity in North Korea's evading UN sanctions on the luxury products coming in to support the extravagant lifestyle of the North Korean military and political elite, who feel that China is fundamental in supporting and buttressing that regime. But it's interesting that the North Koreans show little gratitude to their big brother communist neighbor. You don't see the DPRK thanking China for the food and fuel aid publicly. The enormous sacrifice of 400,000 Chinese troops in defense of North Korea in the Korean War is excluded from DPRK's accounts of the Korean War, even though Chairman Mao's son himself died defending the North Koreans against the UN and Canadian and other forces that were seeking to bring justice to that place. They have a room in their Museum of the War in Pyongyang that they open only when Chinese delegations are there. That makes a modest suggestion. But the relations between Beijing and North Korea are completely supportive. So even though North Korea is not very respectful of China, as China would like from a traditional Confucian worldview of North Korea being a subsidiary regime to China as the Confucian center, a view which I, of course, don't approve of. China always supports North Korea. When North Korea tests nuclear devices, rather than condemnation and sanctions, China typically responds by suggesting that this would be a good pretext for the DPRK and the West and Japan to resume the six-party talks framework negotiations, which, in my view, is simply a way for China to deflect the foreign pressure on the North Korean regime. I've never supported those six-party talks, and I still don't think that they are productive. That's a matter of debate. When DPRK torpedoes a South Korean cruiser in international waters, resulting in the loss of 46 sailors, China maintains that the very compelling evidence that the North fired that torpedo is, as the Chinese put it, inconclusive. When North Korea unleashes an artillery barrage on a South Korean island, China expresses pain and regret at the loss of life and property but echoing the absurd North Korean accounts, suggests the South Koreans started doing first. No, like that. Moreover, China refuses to allow the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees access to Chinese territory bordering Korea on the grounds that none of the thousands and thousands of North Koreans who flee across the border in desperation could possibly be anything but economic migrants. So China's support for DPRK is unwavering, regardless of how bad things get inside North Korea or how irresponsibly the DPRK government behaves abroad. Why is this? A common view is that China is concerned about a refugee crisis if the dictatorship was to implode and waves of North Koreans flood across the border into China. Or another consideration is that China is concerned that if there was reunification of Korea, that China would share a border with a democratic ally of the United States instead of the totalitarian regime currently in Pyongyang. I don't see either of those factors as central to the reason why China provides so much support and sustains the miserable regime that enslaves Korean people who have the misfortune to be living in North Korea. A more compelling factor, in my view, is that China and North Korea are based on the same Stalinist political institutions that have been discarded elsewhere more than 20 years ago. Even though the Chinese regime opened its economy to market forces, the fundamentals of the dictatorship of the one-party state, buttressed by the comprehensive security apparatus, have not changed. So economic change, political, no change. Same system as in DPRK, exactly the same system. Of course, it would be great if the DPRK were to follow a Chinese-style program of opening and reform, economic reform. Wonderful development opportunities in DPRK for Chinese and South Korean investment. Imagine if they would open up the economy to foreign involvement and development. But China has spared no efforts in trying to convince Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung before him that this is the way forward for North Korea. Kim Jong-un does not speak to the Chinese very much. But one only has to look at Chinese history since 1978 to realize that it was after China's opening and economic reform that the portraits of Chairman Mao came down, and that there was a purge. His successor was purged. The leftists were purged, forced into retirement or imprisoned. The influence of the People's Liberation Army declined in China with the political changes. And so I think that the Chinese reform and opening program is a negative example for the Kim regime. Clearly, the Kim family and the regime in general see that if they engage in opening and reform, it would be very good for the nation, but it would be devastating for the privilege of the current elite, the beneficiaries of the Kim military-first totalitarian status quo. And the other factor for China is that if a democratic regime was established in North Korea, then it would affect the balance of power in China against the communist system there. So if the North Koreans became democratic, then the Chinese Communist Party would worry that the demonstration effect of this would be destabilizing to their regime. So regardless of how much the current Chinese leadership is humiliated by the appalling behavior of their comrades in Pyongyang, the DPRK leadership knows there's nothing they can do that will not be backed by China. So Western governments, Japan and South Korea, have to plan their response to the DPRK accordingly. Moreover, China has defined the DPRK more recently under the new leader, Xi Jinping, as one of its core interests in its desire to establish great power relations between China and the United States, implying that China and the United States would divide the world into spheres of influence, and that each of the great powers would acknowledge and respect. And the more direct implication is that China would expect the United States to withdraw troops from ROK, because Korea, of course, would be in the Chinese great power sphere. So this formulation that Mr. Xi keeps trying to press on the U.S. is being rejected. President Obama of the United States, in an address to university students when he was in Australia earlier this month, said, "An effective security order for Asia must be based not on spheres of influence or coercion or intimidation where big nations bully the small, but on alliances of mutual security, international law, and international norms." So even though China would like to establish both North and South Korea as within their sphere of influence, and of course the increasing Chinese economic relationship with ROK helps them in this idea that Korea should become more China-oriented than Western-oriented. The United States is not buying this as a way forward in the world. But recently, when I have attended these meetings, the Chinese are struggling. They're trying to distance the PRC regime from the DPRK regime for different reasons. In the past, they referred to the relationship between China and North Korea as close as lips and teeth. Close as lips and teeth. That's the kind of party-to-party relations that they have. But now they're talking about establishing normal state-to-state relations. This is a new idea floating around in China. And the reasons for this are many. For one thing, the third generation Kim leader, Kim Jong-un, has not been respectful and deferential to the Chinese Communist Party leadership as his father and grandfather, who visited there often. And also within the Chinese leadership, those who had experienced the Korean War and those who had comradely relations with Kim Il-sung are no longer influential in the regime. So that the North Korean factor within the Chinese Communist Party, the pro-North Korean factor within the Chinese Communist Party is weakening, although the pro-North Korean factor within the Chinese military is still strong. The other factor is the impact on China-ROK relations of unconditional loyalty to the DPRK regime. And I think within China, there is genuine concern that the North Korean nuclear program could eventually pose a threat to China, and also that the North Korean nuclear program could become a pretext for Japan remilitarizing and affecting the balance of power in that part of the world. So already the Chinese have reduced the food and energy inputs into DPRK, which means that DPRK is becoming more desperate to try and achieve these things elsewhere. And in fact, we have reports that China has actually started to enforce the sanctions on the deposits that members of the DPRK elite have in Chinese banks in Hong Kong and elsewhere. So China does seem to be showing some signs of trying to pressure the regime. But I am not optimistic that the basic status quo of China-North Korea relations is going to change. So long as China is under the one-party rule of the Communist Party, I believe they will continue to prop up North Korea. And as China becomes stronger, their ability to support the North Korean regime also becomes stronger. But if China moved from authoritarianism to a democratic system, such as you've seen in so many parts, Taiwan, ROK, where a genuine democratic system has developed with respect for citizens' rights, then the support for sustaining the DPRK would weaken. But there's no indication at this time that China is moving towards a freer democratic system. I would conclude by saying that, in my estimation, based on my discussion with my Chinese friends in these strategic study institutes, that if things got very bad inside the DPRK, political instability, you know, the people supporting the current regime under Kim Jong-un fracturing, that it is possible that China could support a Chinese-oriented military coup in the DPRK with a view to improving economic and political stability through opening and reform in North Korea. There are many senior officials of the North Korean military living in China who could be mobilized in such an effort if such a situation emerged. And if there was a Chinese-backed military coup that overthrows the Kim regime, maybe that could form the basis, an unstable basis, but the basis for movement on stable reunification in the years ahead. But the prevailing trend is to none of that. Frankly, at this time, I see no sign of positive change coming to the DPRK that could set in place a series of events leading to Korean reunification. So I end on a depressing note. But that being said, I've often been wrong about things. I thought that the Chinese government would fall in the Tiananmen incident. I never anticipated that that Deng Xiaoping would return to power. So perhaps my pessimism about North Korea should be put in the same box. There are many unknown factors, and one hopes for better things in the years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Burton. 제가 간단히 이번에 강의를 정리해보도록 하겠습니다. 버튼 교수님은 캐나다에서 보는 한반도의 통일 가능성이라는 주제로 강의를 해주셨습니다. 캐나다는 1949년부터 2001년까지 남한만이 한반도의 공식적인 정부로 인정했습니다. 그러나 캐나다는 2001년부터 북한하고도 정치적인 대화를 시작한 바입니다. 그래서 그 이후로부터는 캐나다는 한반도의 북한과 남한의 정부를 같이 인정하게 되었습니다. 캐나다는 북한 정부에게 요구한 바로는 유엔이 주장하고 있는 스탠다드를 따르고 핵무기의 발달과 연구를 중단시키는 걸 주장했습니다. 그리고 또 버튼 교수님은 캐나다의 외교 정책의 세 가지의 성격을 강조하셨는데요. 그 첫째는 경제적인 진흥, 둘째는 안전보호, 그리고 셋째는 캐네디안의 반류를 유지하는 겁니다. 교수님은 캐나다에서 보기로는 남한도 이런 성격을 격려하는 바이고 또 이런 이유로 캐나다와 사이가 좋다 합니다. 그리고 APEC이나 WTO에서 그리고 UN에서도 내세우는 포지션들도 캐나다와 남한은 동의하는 바가 많다고 합니다. 교수님은 중국과 북한의 사이가 한반도의 통일에 관해서 가장 중요하다고 볼 수가 있다고 주장합니다. 우리가 모두 알다시피 북한은 중국의 의지를 많이 하고 있습니다. 그러나 북한은 중국에게 고맙다는 표시는 한 바가 많이 없다고 합니다. 예를 들어서 북한은 중국에서 받아온 음식과 에너지 등을 다른 나라들한테 밝히지도 않고 북한을 위해 싸우다 숨진 약 40여 명 만의 중국 국민들에게도 고맙다는 표시가 없었다고 합니다. 그런데도 불구하고 중국은 오히려 북한을 보호하고 유엔법을 어기기나 또 핵무기를 시험할 때에도 항상 북한 편을 들어줍니다. 교수님에 의하면 중국과 북한은 아직도 20년 전에 소련도 같이 버린 스탈린계의 정치 개념을 아직도 따르고 있다 합니다. 중국은 경제적인 면에서 많이 변하고 있지만 정치적인 면에서는 아직도 변화가 많이 없다고 합니다. 교수님은 김정은이 정치를 유지하는 이상 경제적인 변화가 북한에는 없을 거리라 믿습니다. 그러나 지금은 중국의 변화가 오고 있다고 합니다. 중국은 지금 북한과의 사이가 멀어지고 또 김일성이나 김정일을 존중했던 중국 정치인들도 지나갔다고 합니다. 그리고 중국이 보기엔 김정일이 중국을 무시하는 게 많이 보인다는 의견도 있다 합니다. 그래서 중국은 북한에 보내는 음식과 에너지도 많이 줄였고 옛날같이 도와주지는 않다고 합니다. 결론적으로 교수님이 보기에는 중국의 역량으로 인해 한반도의 통일을 이룰 수가 있다고 합니다. 그리고 그 변화는 중국의 정치적인 변화가 먼저 있어야만 가능하다고 본답니다. 중국의 공산주의가 민주주의로 변화시키길 노력하고 격려하는 게 통일을 제일 빨리 이룰 수 있는 조건이라는 말을 주장합니다. 감사합니다.
열강을 해주신 닥터 찰스 버튼께 그리고 박준석 의원께 다시 한번 뜨거운 박수 부탁드립니다.